Good morning, YouTube. Today we're going to talk about the Middle East and how great that is. The Middle East is an interesting area. There's a lot of evidence that it was the cradle of civilization, that's where we first built our first cities and started moving away from being hunter-gatherers and into being more of an agricultural kind of society with specialists and all the technological innovations that arose because of that. But unfortunately, now the Middle East is just an insane place full of religious fanatics of all flavors and a whole bunch of fossil fuels that they can dig up from dead dinosaurs millions of years ago, which has not really worked out well for anybody, frankly. It's a pretty bad power source when you think about it. It's dirty. The pollution that it causes when you're burning it is bad for you to breathe, whether you think it affects the global climate, etc., or not. It's also easily monopolized. The oil pipeline and gas reserves and etc. are pretty easy to own by corporations, and the price fixing in the oil market is pretty obvious if you look at it. But now, apparently, we want to go in and do some more regime change. They tried to claim that Assad gassed his own people, and it turned out, well, no, it was Israeli and American rebels, aka ISIS, aka Al-Qaeda, aka whatever you want to call the CIA, Mossad backed thugs that are doing all the atrocities there locally. It turns out that it was them, of course. They're the ones beheading people and everything else too. It's pretty standard CIA Mossad operation tactic. You send in these absolutely insane, vile people, who do, rape and torture and murder all the local indigenous people in the area. Same thing we did in South America, the Iran-Contra thing. Well, just the Contras, I guess, was that portion of it. We're doing the same thing now, of course, in Syria, the same thing we did in Iraq, and the same thing we did in so many CIA-inspired regime change schemes, which always work so well, right? I mean, we put in these horrible dictators like Saddam Hussein. Yeah, we put in Saddam Hussein. That was a CIA job when he was first installed. So then we come in later and take him out. You can make money on both transactions. It's great. Of course, it's terrible for the local people. It's terrible for the world, for the entire global population, because now you have, these maniacal mass murdering thugs in public, gassing their own people and all kinds of other stuff. So anyway, we're in Syria, and now it looks like there's a potential that we could get into an actual real war with a real adversary, Russia in this case, because, well, they're sick of our regime change, especially when Syria is so close to their border. I mean, imagine if they were trying to do a regime change in Mexico or Canada, and, of course, we'd send troops in to try and keep that from happening. And at some point, we may fire on each other, or they might fire on our troops, or we may fire on their troops. Either way, it's not going to be pretty when it happens. And is that the path of World War III? Perhaps. Is that what, is that what the Zionist-controlled media and the corporate cabal bankers want? Probably. They seem to do pretty well every time there's a major international conflict. The Rothschilds just get richer and richer, whether it's World War I or World War II, or, so why not World War III? Let's make that money again, right? But the real problem in the Middle East, though, really is Israel. And all the other candidates, they don't want to address Israel as anything but our ally. And there's a reason for that. Half of our government are dual Israeli citizens. Israel and Mossad control our entire media, pretty much. So, I mean, that's the only narrative you're going to hear is that Israel is our ally. But the reality is Israel is not our ally. Israel, in fact, is the only country that I can think of that we haven't gone to war with who's attacked American ships, the USS Liberty. It's interesting they attacked a ship called the USS Liberty too. It's that's so symbolic, and it would almost be ironic if it wasn't just such a perfect metaphor for the entire situation. There's all evidence points to Israel doing 9/11 with collusion of Dick Cheney and numerous others, of course. But, you know, they actually caught dancing, celebrating, selfie-taking Israeli Mossad agents on 9/11 who claimed that they were there to document the event. So if they were there to document the event, that means they knew the event was going to happen. And if you were somebody's ally and you knew they were about to get stabbed in the back, I mean, wouldn't you say something? You know, so that's my main problem with all the candidates right now. I mean, whether you want to talk about Donald Trump, who's obviously a ridiculous media whore, and the fact that he's been considered a potential candidate is, you know, speaks volumes to the intelligence of the American consumer, or at least the media that's, you know, setting up the narrative that we're supposed to feel is somehow accurate representation of reality. It's clearly not. And then Bernie Sanders, too. You know, Bernie Sanders voted to send billions to Israel while they were in the middle of committing a genocide. I mean, what Israel's doing in Palestine, I don't see how anybody can justify that. They're bombing residential areas, sometimes with weapons that are actually illegal internationally due to the Geneva Convention. They've bombed residential areas with white phosphorus. If you have any idea what white phosphorus does to a human body, it's terrifying and unbelievably horrible. And, you know, this is an area where old people live and babies, and they're launching white phosphorus on them. And while they're in the middle of perpetrating this heinous act, one of the most heinous acts of the last 100 years, we vote to send them billions more in aid. You know, I mean, meanwhile, Detroit, I mean, look at Detroit. Do you think we couldn't have spent the money on something better? You know, like, I don't know, anything. We could have spent the money on literally anything and it would have been better. But instead we sent it to Israel so that they could continue bombing residential areas in Palestine, bulldozing houses where people have lived for centuries, where families have lived for centuries. You know, and they claim, you know, oh, there was a rocket attack or whatever. But it's ridiculous. None of these rocket attacks, I mean, ever hit a target, really, you know. It's not like Netanyahu was ever, like, actually in physical danger himself, you know. Hell no. He's in a bunker somewhere launching drone strikes, just like Dick Cheney, just like all these criminals. That's really the place where the whole thing should really unravel. I mean, if you look at 9/11, the evidence is overwhelming that those buildings were demolished with a controlled demolition. There were thermite cutter charges. You can even see steel I-beams that were cut perfectly diagonally at a 45-degree angle. You know, that's not going to happen from an office fire and a building implosion as a result of the office fire. A perfect 45-degree angle cut on a giant steel I-beam. I mean, that steel is, it's industrial grade steel. If you hold a really good knife, you can feel the thickness and the weight of that metal. Just take a really good pocket knife. Somebody you know has a good pocket knife. Maybe you have a good pocket knife. Hold that pocket knife in your hand. Feel the weight of that metal. Now imagine that, you know, 10, 100 times thicker. I mean, just, you know, huge, thick pieces of steel. You know, just, you know, cut straight in a perfect line, you know, and then the building falling in perfect symmetry right into its own footprint. You know, if the plane had caused a structural failure, it wouldn't have been so even and straight down like that. It would have, you know, the whole building would have, if the airplane hit the side of the building, it would have toppled, you know, maybe laid out half of Manhattan or whatever. I mean, it would have been totally different. But that's not what you see. I mean, you see them exploding from the top down. They didn't find anything solid left out of those buildings. I mean, one of the firefighters who was cleaning up the mess, he said, the biggest chunk we found was a piece this big of a phone keypad. He says everything else was just tiny little pieces. I mean, just huge explosion. So it's pretty clear to me, and also to architects and engineers and physicists and anybody in the scientific field that those buildings were blown up, from the top down in a controlled demolition. And of course, like I said, we caught Israelis celebrating and taking selfies in front of the towers after the first plane hit. So, I mean, that would have been pretty amazing if they would have got into position like that so quickly. I mean, the two plane hits didn't even happen that far apart. It was an hour and a half or something like that. It wasn't even that long apart. So how did they get up there with all these cameras and start taking selfies? It just doesn't, the official narrative makes no sense. And it usually doesn't in a situation like this. Same thing with JFK, I mean, you could see his head get blown back into the left. I mean, you could see the impact as the bullet hits his forehead and his head goes back into the left. And, and they're claiming the shooter was over here, But, if you've shot something, if you've ever shot a gun before, you would know that the impact coming from there would make him jerk forward and to the left, not back and to the left. So clearly he was shot from in front. All the witnesses said, "Oh, we saw smoke and heard shots coming from the grassy knoll." But again, that doesn't matter. If you control the news, you control the narrative. You control what happens. You control what people think, and that's really the problem in this country. And that's why, I don't think Donald Trump, Bernie Sanders, any of these ludicrous Zionist sock puppets, are a good choice for president. And that's why I'm running for president. Again, not that it matters, even if my YouTube channel started getting a bunch of hits, they just rig the counter, that's what they do. But anyway, that's what's going on in the Middle East, and we shouldn't be there at all. I definitely stick with the founding fathers on that one, as well as most of the things that I think, not that I'm a complete isolationist, but I kind of am a complete isolationist. I mean, why the hell are we in other countries doing anything? I mean, we have enough work to do here at home in our country. What about rebuilding our manufacturing base? What about rebuilding our small family-owned farms, and getting away from Monsanto agribusiness? Imagine if, instead of these giant factory farms that are poisoning everything, we had small family-owned farms that raised, organic heirloom crops that were actually healthy for you, that actually provided nutrition for you and your children, instead of this, cancerous garbage covered in Roundup, GMO crap that nobody wants. Nobody wants that crap. Everybody knows it's crap. Even complete idiots are like, no, I don't really want GMO corn or apples. That doesn't sound like a good idea, because it's obvious. I mean, even total tool bags are aware that it's not good for you to eat. So, yeah, I think we have enough to do in this country. I don't think we need to send billions of dollars to Israel so they can continue killing little children and old people. I just don't see the merit in that. And frankly, if Bernie Sanders does see the merit in that, well, I have a word for Bernie Sanders.